Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Horn Call Podcast. My name is James Bolden. I'm the publications editor for the IHS and your host. My guest today is Steven Juliani, a composer, a horn player, a music preparer, music copyist, and actually a trained attorney, believe it or not. So part of our discussion today focuses around Steven's various careers that he's had, both in and out of music, and the way that all of those threads have contributed to his success both in and out of the music business. Most recently, Steven has taken up composing. He's been composing for a while, but I would say that his compositions are getting more and more prominent. He recently had a piece of his premiered by members of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, so I would say that is a pretty high level of recognition for one's compositions. So I don't want to give too much of the conversation away today, but let's get right into my conversation with Steven Juliani. Delighted to have you here talking with me today. And Steve, do you go by Steve or Steven?
Well, lots of people call me Steve, but my mom used to say, I named you Steven. So let's go with Steven.
Okay, perfect. Well, Steven, welcome today. And by way of an introduction, if you don't mind maybe giving us a little bit of a brief intro to who you are and what you're doing right now. And part of today's discussion is going to involve the very interesting path you took to where you are. So, tease as much of that as you want, reveal as much as you want right now, and then we'll definitely circle back to it later.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been a member of the International Horn Society for a long, long time. I mean, I remember as a young boy reading the Horn Call. And in those days, it was before we had podcasts and YouTube, before the internet, before cell phones. You didn't have access to information about the horn world, about what it meant to be a professional musician. And the Horn Call was one of the really cool ways you could learn about, who were the professional horn players, what they were doing, what issues were important to them, just everything that was going on in the horn world. So the Horn Call has always been a huge resource for me. And of course, I'm still a subscriber, and it's quite an honor to be on the podcast with you today.
Well, we're glad to have
you. Thank you. So I started I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and both my parents were amateur musicians. My father played the horn a little bit. I grew up hearing him playing trying to play till. And, I just loved the sound of the horn, from before I ever played the horn. And at some point picked it up, and I took pretty naturally to it and had quite a bit of success with it through high school, and got into Curtis, went to Curtis, studied with Mason Jones there, and had a wonderful experience at Curtis, just being around extremely high level performance. At Curtis at that time, they expected us to behave and perform like professional musicians. And that was a difficult experience, but looking back on it, I learned a tremendous amount there that I didn't realize I was learning. And then after that, took bunches of auditions, came close in a few, ended up going to LA, and I got a master's degree. It wasn't my intention, but it just kind of came along the way, studying with Vince DeRosa at USC, which was also a wonderful experience. I mean, Vince was just an overpowering horn player. I mean, he would pick up the horn and play stuff, and you would just be stunned by how effortless and beautiful it was, everything that he played. It was just, he was an incredible musician. The people that were around him were just overwhelmed by what a great player he was. And you would hear all the time, this guy is the greatest brass musician that's ever lived. I mean, it was really stunning to be around him. And I played professionally in LA, and sort of, I never really got into the main scene there, which would have been doing motion picture work. I played in the Santa Barbara Symphony. I did live stuff. I did some shows, and then at some point I won't bore you with all the details, but I was looking for something a little more stable. I was doing a lot of driving and I wasn't making a ton of money. And I kind of stumbled into music copying as another thing to do. And quickly I did an apprenticeship, and quickly within probably a year, I was working full time as a copyist, and I just sort of set the horn aside, which was a huge thing for me. I think I was 31 at the time, somewhere in that range. And I was kind of ready to have a stable profession. But it meant putting down the horn, something that I had been dedicated to for my entire sort of thinking life up to that point. But I had grown kind of frustrated with the difficulty of trying to piece together a career. And I think I had also started to feel a lot of pressure with auditions. They ceased to be about just playing the horn and playing beautifully, and more about trying to win a job, which of course made a difficult situation even more difficult. So I was kind of ready for that. And within, I think I said within almost a year of working as a copyist, I was working full time. I mean, it was sort of the opposite of horn playing. At that point, there was a lot of opportunity in Los Angeles. It was a very busy time. There was a lot of recording going on. There were several recording orchestras working all the time. The work at that time was all, copying was all done by hand. So there were more people needed to do it. And because of my background as a player, I fit nicely into a role where I spent a lot of time on recording stages as a librarian. I would be there to make changes to the music as it was being recorded, which happened all the time. It was actually a really stressful job that a lot of people wanted nothing to do with, but I loved. So
what's stress after being a horn player, right?
Exactly. I mean, honestly, I felt that my entire life. Whenever I quote get into a stressful situation, it's like, well, I mean, it's not like playing the horn.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
The horn is the horn is a hard instrument to play professionally. It was for me. And I was a good horn player. I had a lot of success with it. So I found myself doing the work as a copyist that I had aspired to do as a horn player. And the copyists are on the musician's union contract. I was being paid actually better than I would be if I had been one of the folks in the horn section. So I was super happy about that. And I was working on lots of big films, and it was great. And it really became something like where I had to actually turn down work.
Oh, wow.
I could have worked absolutely full time, like 7 days a week. And so I did that for quite a few years, and eventually I started my own copying business, which I still have now. And then we gravitated to doing everything on computers, and that turned in, it's been a long career of doing that kind of work and, building a business.
Mm-hmm.
So, we actually just had probably the busiest year my business has ever had has been this year, which is kind of shocking to me. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but it's a bit of chance, are my clients happening to be busy during that time, and it's a bit of us working to position ourselves to be able to, we constantly have to adapt to be able to meet the needs of our clients. It means becoming orchestrators sometimes more than copyists. So
sure, yeah,
that's a whole interesting world that I have spent probably way more time in my life doing that than as a horn player. But through all of that, I still just thought of myself as a horn player. And then I would say about 10 years ago now, 9 years ago, one of my good friends and former colleagues in LA, Brian O'Connor, who was a hugely successful studio horn player. In his era, he played on everything, and was a principal horn player, as well as played in the section with Jim Thatcher. And Brian was a good friend of mine. We had played Phantom of the Opera together on and off for a number of years. And he had battled a brain tumor for a long time, and he died. And his fiance asked me to write a piece for his memorial service. And I thought, maybe she thinks copyist is the same thing as a composer. I wasn't sure why that happened. Actually, looking back on it recently, I realized that I had written some sort of song type stuff in that era, and I think Brian knew about that. So maybe he thought of me as a composer in a way that I didn't even think of myself as a composer. But so I did write a piece for his memorial service, which was played in LA, and also talking to my friend Mike Gast about that, who's principal horn in the Minnesota Orchestra. He and I kind of came up with this idea of, well, let's record this thing. It would be kind of fun to record this. So he and I got together a group of his colleagues in the Minnesota Orchestra, and they have a really great thing there in Minnesota that the orchestra owns the hall. So the musicians have access to the hall. They can, if it's available, they can sign out the hall and use the hall.
That's incredible.
So we were able to go into their hall and record that piece. And that was such an amazing experience, the whole thing, that it just kind of lit a fire for me that, that was so much fun. I want to do more of that. So that got me started writing music, and I have never stopped. I believe that was 8 years ago.
Yeah, and I've seen your website. You've got quite a number of compositions ranging from, unaccompanied horn, chamber music, all the way up to large ensemble stuff.
Yeah. I've kept writing, and I kind of bounce around. My career has been, as a composer, has been really driven by relationships that I have with either people that I went to school with, like Michael Gast. He and I were classmates at Curtis. And then his colleagues in the Minnesota Orchestra, who I met through him, like Steve Campbell is the principal tuba player in the Minnesota Orchestra. I've written a piece for Steve, which he premiered. I'm working on a second piece for him right now. And I wrote a piece, it's a low brass quintet, it's called, for Michael and the trombone and tuba sections.
I saw that, yeah.
They recorded that and performed it live in orchestra in a chamber music concert in Orchestra Hall, and then along the way I've made friends with horn players that I've met mostly in the Bay Area. Mark Allman, and Kevin Rivard, who were co-principal horns in the San Francisco Opera. I met Kevin at a recording session at Skywalker Ranch, and he and I just kind of instantly, connected, and we've been friends ever since. And I think I met Mark through Kevin. I think when they were doing the ring cycle on the San Francisco Opera, I met Mark then and some of the other members of the section, including Jeffrey Pilkington, who's the principal horn in the Kennedy Center Orchestra. And Jeffrey, I did a piece called Explore that he asked me to write for the group, the 8D Sound, a group of 8D players. And then I'm working on a piece. I'm getting ready to start a piece right now that Jeffrey asked me to write for his group, the Van Buren Winds, which is a woodwind quintet. And of course, part of the reason we're talking today is that Mark Allman, who's now principal horn in the Chicago Symphony, asked me to write this piece for him that they just performed there. So, I mean, it's interesting. It's been relationships with horn players and other musicians who are playing at a really high level that those relationships have been what have driven my composing career. Also, Bob Reardon, who is one of the horn players in the National Symphony, has been another person who's been really supportive of my music. So I'm not sure exactly how that happened, but I guess, like in any business, it is relationships. And then another key person for me is Jim Stevenson, who I met because all of the Minnesota brass players would say, well, you really need to talk to Jim Stevenson. You guys have the same thing, because Jim had a much bigger career than me as a professional trumpet player, but then gravitated into arranging.
Yep.
And then became a very, very busy composer. I'm going next month to hear the premiere of a ballet he just wrote for the Joffrey.
Oh, cool.
His career is on fire, but we had a similar path in that we were both brass players who became composers. So I met Jim, and he's been very supportive. My music has helped me get my music performed. He introduced me to Jason Fettig, who was the director of the President's Own U.S. Marine Band, the White House Band, and they played a piece of mine. And Jim, he's extremely generous. So I've been fortunate. I've had people who have become good friends who have supported my music, and that's really driven my composing career. And I've followed that, when someone has said, oh, it'd be really cool if you wrote a piece. I'm like, okay, I do that,
Yeah.
So I think, I don't know if I covered my whole path there, but it's been a journey from horn player to copyist. Oh, I left out one part in there. I went to law school.
I saw that. I was like, at some point in there, you found the time to get a law degree.
That happened. And I think this is one of the main things that I would like to impart to your listeners, that I think my story is about being able to adapt and change gears and see new opportunities. And I think that's an important skill to have for any musician. We're trying to make a living in a very difficult world. We're not ones and zeros people. We're not, unfortunately, in this era, really appreciated by our society in a way that allows us to support ourselves in an easy way. But there are ways to support yourself as a musician. They exist, but I do think you have to be flexible. And I know for me as a horn player, I was trained from the very beginning to have this single-minded focus, like you're an athlete, which I definitely had. I never for a second thought I would do anything other than play some position in a professional symphony orchestra. And but that mindset has its limits. There's a point at which you have to recognize that either that, sort of a dispassionate realization that may not happen for you, or that maybe developing some other options would be helpful to you, maybe take the pressure off of trying to achieve everything through the horn. there's a whole variety of reasons why it's a good idea, but I think the idea of opening yourself to other opportunities kind of flies in the face of the training that we have, where we have to be so single-minded. So, I mean, looking back on it, I think that single-minded focus was really good training for me, certainly as a young person, to just, really focus on an objective and work very hard towards it. That is never a bad thing to learn how to do. But my first step there to go from horn player to copyist was very difficult for me psychologically, but turned out to be very rewarding. That transition happened over probably the period of about a year, and there were a sequence of various events there that led to that opportunity opening up for me. But they were really they all happened because I started to change my focus. I started, wherever I went, I was thinking part of the time about, is there another opportunity here that I see around me? I just kind of started to open my eyes and ears a little bit to that. I wasn't desperate, but I just started to, take in information around me in a little different way. Yeah. And that led to that opportunity, which worked out really well for me. So I think it's good to maybe have a little bit of that in the back of your mind all the time, to be open to other opportunities. So
yeah, I think sometimes people, as you're saying, single-minded musicians, and that's sort of the archetype or stereotype of, the single-minded composer, performer, whomever. But I think especially the economic situation today, just keeping an open mind, being flexible, as you said, it almost, though, I can kind of see why people almost feel like, well, they're in some way being unfaithful to themselves by exploring a different kind of career. And I agree with you 100%. Like that can't be a way forward. You can't just exclude everything else, just to pursue that one thing. Yes, you have to be dedicated. Yes, you have to put in the time and the hours and all of that stuff, but you're still a human being, right? You're not a machine that was created to do this one thing. It's not a very healthy mindset from my perspective.
No, and I think there's even more to that in terms of being like a really well-rounded musician, not just put aside horn player. There's, the more that I've gone forward in composition, there's a different way of listening to music, of experiencing music, of studying music. There's a different perspective than that of the horn player, where and I had this for years. You go to a concert, you go to hear Brahms too, for example, and you're like, well, let's see how all the horn solos go.
See where they breathe. Yeah.
Yeah. Just let's see how the third horn player is going to do on this one, and it's like, but I'm sorry, Brahms too is not about the horn parts.
Exactly.
Brahms too is a great symphony, and there's a totality of music going on there. And I experience music very differently now from a composer perspective than I do when I was a horn player. And I think that I would have been a better horn player had I opened my ears up to that when I was playing the horn, So I think, what could be part of what we're talking about here is, as a horn player, you try to broaden your experience as a musician, to take in more of the musical world and try to avoid restricting your field to just that of a horn player sitting in the back of the orchestra. Right. It's a very different perspective. And I just wanted to get back to the little bit about going to law school, so I can put that my path.
Yeah.
Because it's another example of how I changed focus. And that one happened, I went to law school in my 40s. So I was convinced that my copying business, which was, my profession at that point, still is, was going to collapse, not because of how we were running the business, because in the industry as a whole, there were real changes in the motion picture industry. The studios were being bought by large corporations that were changing the numbers of films that were being produced. And I just thought that combined with less and less recording going on with live musicians, I made a calculation that, I don't think this business is going to be viable within 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And, what if I went to law school at night, got myself a law degree, then I would be positioned to be able to keep working in some way. Mm-hmm. As a copyist, I really could only support myself in LA or London. And
right.
Anyway, so I just did that because I didn't want to be in a position, like in my 50s and be unemployable. Mm-hmm. That really scared me. And I figured that I could afford, financially to go to law school. And I went and I put no pressure on myself to get good grades. And I think it took me 4 years to get a law degree because I kept having to pull out of semesters because we would get a big movie and I wouldn't have the time. Anyway, and it took me a while to pass the bar exam because I had never had to do anything like that in my life. I mean, I got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, but I never really had been a serious student. Mm-hmm. I didn't really know how to do that. But I did pass the bar exam and I practiced criminal defense for about 3.5 years. Mm. At some point I realized, well, my business in LA did not collapse, still going fine. And that was around the time I sort of stumbled into composing, and I decided that I would stop practicing law and use that time to compose music. So I'm still licensed in California, but I don't practice, but I could go back to it if I had to. So
I imagine, I know you don't do like necessarily contract law, but I imagine having a knowledge of the law has its advantages as a copyist, as a musician, as an entrepreneur. I mean, just being able to see things in that way.
Does. I mean, I think, the main thing that you learn as an attorney, it's what they don't tell you they're going to teach you this in law school, but it's what you end up learning, and you really use it as an attorney, is the ability to take a large amount of information, like a criminal case. You get the police report, you get all this evidence that comes to you, and you have to sift through it and figure out what's really important. And then you have to sift through a body of law that applies to it and figure out what's important. Sift through some cases and figure out which ones are on point. You got to take all this information and sift through it and refine it down to what are the key points. And that is a useful skill just in life. I think it actually helps me composing music, maybe. I don't know, but yeah, I'm
plus a lot of Latin. Plus, you have to learn a lot of Latin, is my understanding.
Yeah, and I think it was. I've always liked to read. It was kind of fun to do something that was completely not music, but this was also an interesting aside, having been a horn player, that I gravitated to criminal law, which was surprising to me. In law school, I thought, of course, I'm going to go into entertainment law.
Right.
I've been working in the movie business for years, and I discovered that entertainment law is just about money, and which I had absolutely no interest in. I'm not interested in the money aspect of anything that I do. But I discovered that where I really had a skill that others didn't have was in the courtroom. In law school, they had us do some mock trial stuff, and I was like, I felt no problem standing up and talking. Okay, and I remember feeling like, oh, I don't have to worry about what note is going to come out. I just hear, I have a thought in my head and I speak. Uh-huh. And, generally I'm able to speak the word that I want to speak.
It's like a hidden superpower. And, I've read so many accounts of a lot of people's greatest fear is speaking in public. And as you know, as a musician, a performing musician, that's something that you just have to confront so head on that a lot of people just rarely have to deal with it that way. So
yeah, I mean, playing in an orchestra is an extremely challenging thing to do, especially the horn where you're in the spotlight, no matter what. Our players just they forget, they just get used to that. But it's an amazing skill to have in our society. And, when I had to stand up in court and argue in front of a judge, I just felt like it was easy. It was really easy, as long as I was prepared. And I always, I made a point of being prepared. And that's another skill that we've learned as professional musicians. You do not show up on the job unprepared. You're fully prepared to do what you have to do. So yeah, I think for me, all of these things have played into being a composer in some way for me. And as I said, I think that's one lesson I have to offer to your listeners is be open to other opportunities, prepare yourself for other opportunities, be a good musician, study the music that you're trying to learn. Don't just study the horn parts. Be open-minded and be willing to accept other opportunities when they come your way. Yeah. We can do more than one thing at a time.
Yeah. And our brains are amazing organs, just the way they adapt and the way we can both convince ourselves of things that aren't true and, talk ourselves out of things that are true. So.
Yeah. And fortunately, as a horn player, most horn players don't have the ability to practice 8 hours a day. I never felt like I wanted to practice much more than 3 hours a day. I know there are players that do, but, there's a chunk of time in the rest of the day where you could try focusing on something else, and I think that's really healthy. So,
well, I wanted to ask you a question about the copyist part of your career, and then I wanted to maybe we can spend the last part of this podcast talking about your compositions, because that's what's kind of front of mind right now. But so when you mentioned copying as a career, I kind of nodded as if I knew exactly what that meant, but I'm going to be honest, I don't know exactly what that means. I'm familiar with it, but maybe for anyone else who's kind of like me, could you kind of walk through what the job of a copyist is on, say, a big film score production or something?
Sure. These days, I think we try to call it music preparation.
Okay, sure, yeah.
Somehow, the word copyist doesn't tell the whole story. And I think part of that is because what the job has evolved over the years. When I first started, you would get a score that was prepared by hand, either by the composer or an orchestrator, on a full orchestral score. Depending on what the ensemble was, it could vary. We did lots of different kind of work. So if you're working on something that's in a string arrangement for a pop album, it would just be the strings, but lots of times it would be full orchestral score, all done by hand. So, in pencil. Right. And we would copy that. A team of copyists would take that score, and your job is to prepare the individual parts that every player is going to use in a recording session. And we would be copying using special pens and triangles so that all the lines were very straight. And there was a beautiful style of hand copying in Los Angeles that was very artistic, and the look and feel of the music was a very defined standard that was extremely professional and really fun to be part of. So that's the fundamental job. You take a score that has all of the parts and you create the individual parts that each player is going to play from. What's behind all of that and what is the real core of the job is making sure that there are no errors in the parts and also in the score, that, a music preparation office has copyists that are creating the parts, proofreaders that are proofreading the parts and the score, people that are printing the parts and the score. There's multiple facets to this operation. And at the end of the job, our job is to deliver to the recording stage, whether that's in Los Angeles or anywhere else in the world, music that is, when it's recorded, there's going to be zero problems with it. Mm-hmm. And film composers or commercial composers often have to learn the hard way how important it is to have a good copyist, because when you don't, you find out on the scoring stage.
And you're burning time, you're wasting studio time fixing it.
Yes. It's incredibly expensive when you have an orchestra sitting there on a scoring stage. And when you have problems, say like a part mistransposed or bars missing, or there's a million different ways things can go wrong. On a cue, on a scoring stage with all these people involved, it can be really hard to figure out what's wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's when you realize that, the $5,000 or $10,000 that it would have cost me to hire a really professional operation, I have just wasted right here.
Right.
Plus, I'm very frustrated, and so sometimes composers have to learn the hard way because copyists, a professional music preparation office like mine is not inexpensive. Mm-hmm. So it's often kind of a shocking extra expense on a film project that people don't anticipate. But these days, what we are is really kind of an orchestration hopping office. Often we're working directly with the composer and taking their sequencer files, and an audio source will get delivered a sequencer file, which is directly from the composer, which was performed in their studio, and then a recording of that performance. And our job is to take that and create a full score and flesh it all out, orchestrate it, create a series of parts, deliver that. And that's a completely different job than it was when I started. There's a different set of responsibilities there. And, but I think this is part of our earlier conversation for me, that my business, we have been able to evolve over the years. And I have a partner in that business, Nick Vivola. Nick started working for me many years ago, and has been with me for all through the time, on and off. But he and I now run the business together, and he and I, we're constantly trying to adapt and stay ahead of where the business is going and what the needs will be of our clients. And it's challenging because with technology now, things change very rapidly. Finale just collapsed, which has been probably our main program for many, many years. So now we're in the process of switching to Dorico, which is the first switch. Yeah. But you have to stay ahead of these things. So, and Nick has also been someone who's been super supportive to me in my composing career. I bounce ideas with him, and he proofreads some of my stuff for me and makes amazingly helpful comments that, so he's another person who's been really supportive and helpful to me as a composer, even though we're colleagues in a separate business. So,
right. Well, and to your point about just the kind of the path you took to that copying business, that's not necessarily a degree you can get in school. It's not like a teaching degree or a law degree. You're good at that job because of the sum total of all the experiences you had musically and otherwise kind of leading up to that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the main skill that there's people that contact us looking for work, and over the years we've identified ways of evaluating people and what are the primary skills needed in that work, and the number one skill is musicianship. Are you an excellent musician? Can you look at a score and get a feel for, is there something wrong here? I mean, how do you define that skill? I don't know, but there's a lot of musicianship that goes into that. That and technical prowess, these days. You have to be very skillful with Macintosh computers and a whole variety of programs. And then the ability to work extremely long hours, which is sometimes the thing that's the deal breaker. Lots of people, well, not lots of people, but some people can have the first two criteria, but it's difficult to work 10 days in a row for 10 or 12 hours a day. And that's often how we have to work.
Because it's on a deadline. Yeah, the story is starting at a certain date and it's got to be ready by
It's all intensely deadline driven. So it's an interesting job. It is. Not for everybody, but it's a good job for especially people trying to break in to that industry. I've had a lot of people work with us over the years who went on to, be composers themselves or other jobs in the business. So
that's amazing. And that's good advice. And, for anybody whose kind of interest is piqued by this, that's something definitely to explore more. Steven, I want to talk a little bit about your compositions. And, you mentioned that early piece, first piece, I guess, other than, student type stuff that you wrote for your friend Brian O'Connor. How has if at all, how has your approach to composition and your style, influences, et cetera, how has that changed over the years as you've become more experienced as a composer?
How has my style changed?
If at all,
It's interesting. I think my way of composing music, if I have one, is all driven by my inner world, by my own emotional state, by my desire to connect with how I experience the world around me. It's never driven by any sort of technical idea of, I'm or some external way of thinking about music. It's all from within my own psyche, which makes the hearing of music I've written kind of terrifying. It wasn't anything that I anticipated because I never really, like I said, I never really set out to be a composer. I didn't realize that when you write music, somebody might play it. So I do think the way I've written music has changed. I think maybe it's more just from getting some greater sense of confidence that whatever I think in my head sounds good, that other people might think sounds good too. Because there's a huge leap there. I mean, I don't have the kind of ego where I think whatever I think is right, everybody else is going to think is right too. I heard an interview with Ringo Starr the other day, and he was like, we're just some blokes from Liverpool, and we didn't know anybody was going to like anything we were doing, but it turned out they did. It's like, maybe this is just what it is to create anything. You're never sure that anybody else is going to like it. So, I think I do have a little bit more confidence now that I can kind of just move forward with stuff. There's always a battle within me. I think within any artist, this battle, the idea that, is this good? Is this going to be okay? Is this all right? Is this idea worth pursuing? And I have to constantly remind myself that, you can do whatever you want. You're the one that gets to decide whether anybody else will ever see this. Mm-hmm. It's a process of kind of like the stuff in the law of whittling down these ideas until you get something where you're very convinced that this is what you want to say. Right. And so, it's a very involved process that for me requires a lot. It's not casual at all. It requires a lot of time and emotional energy. And I find when I really get my teeth into a piece, I'm composing when I'm asleep. I have to sometimes get up in the middle of the night and and start working because why am I kidding myself here? I'm not sleeping. My mind is going, and you just have to go with it. It becomes kind of all consuming. It's a little bit too much sometimes, but I think it's worth it to try to create something that hopefully makes the world a better place, that brings some kind of joy or draws out emotion in the listener. That fundamentally for me has been what my goal, if I have one, is to try to create emotion in others through experiencing music that I wrote. And that's a hard thing to know that you're able to do, but it is fundamentally the goal. And this actually reminds me of something I wanted to talk to you about, James, which is, I think, also really important for horn players, and something that I've learned, which is that music is not about technique. When I was a young horn player, the whole time I was studying, I was very concerned with, can I play the full register of the instrument? Can I play loud up high? Can I play soft in the middle register? Can I master all of the technical requirements of the horn? But that is not the goal. The goal is to play beautiful music.
Expression.
And expression. As a composer, I realize that music comes from an internal place for me, as I said. And this is true for any composer. The music is coming out of their head, and that music is coming from emotion. No matter what, it's coming from a psychology. And when that music is performed, the composer wants to hear that back. I remember Jim Stevenson, who I mentioned earlier, my friend Jim, saying to somebody that composers never mind a performer, taking license with their music. Like, a performer saying, for example, I'm not sure that this is what you meant here, but I thought I would try and play this phrase this way. Any composer is going to be like, wonderful, because now you're trying to get inside the music. You're trying to understand what the composer is trying to say. You're trying to make something beautiful out of the music. And this is what all performers should do. For me, if I had to do it over again as a horn player, if I was, like trying to play Till, for example, I would listen to that piece. And when I'm listening to the recordings, I wouldn't be listening for the beauty of the articulation or, how great that low C sounds or, I wouldn't be listening to the technical aspects of the horn solo. I would be listening to what role does that horn solo play in that piece of music? What is Strauss trying to say with this horn solo here? And it's very clearly comical. It's comical.
Everything's on the wrong beat.
Yeah, exactly. It's comical. And bum, bum, bum. It's oafish. It's comical. And I never thought of it that way as a horn player. I thought, this is the greatest horn solo ever written, and I'm going to just nail that, No, but if you think of it as comical, or however you think of it, you figure out your own way of thinking about that horn solo. And then when you go into an audition and play it like that, believe me, that committee is going to wake up because you're going to be the only person that played it with some style that revealed that you actually have a concept of this piece of music.
And you get it. Yeah, you get the piece. Yeah.
So, and my training was always like, well, you get all the technique down and then you go back and you make it really musical. To me, that is exactly wrong. You start from the beginning with what is the musical statement that I'm trying to make with this music. And that's the study that's the study that makes you more well-rounded as a musician, because you study that piece of music. Maybe that means studying the score. Maybe it means listening to a bunch of recordings. Maybe it means reading about Strauss as a person. Maybe it's all of those things and many more. But talking to your teachers, whatever, you come up with a concept in your mind of what this piece of music is trying to say.
Right.
And then you set about executing that, and you never deviate from creating a piece of beautiful music. That is the goal.
Yeah. Well, and I think, to your point, like, it's not about the technique. I mean, a single note can be beautiful. And so it's not even really about a melody. It's not, it's almost like it's magic. There's nothing there, but a single note can just strike you in a certain way as a listener. And it's just, there's so many moments like that in the repertoire.
There are. And I mean, I understand that, there is, we're like gymnasts. There's technical requirements to producing a piece of music. All I'm trying to say is that this idea of making music has to be forefront. Yeah. And you know what? If you drop a couple notes along the way, who cares? As a composer, I could care less. I really do not care about technical precision in the music. If I hear a performance of the music I'm written, I'm not thinking about missed notes or bad articulation or anything like that. Is there beautiful music being made here? Mm-hmm. So I have discovered that, when my focus changed to writing music, my complete focus on experiencing music changed. And it enabled me to appreciate lots of different kinds of music that I really didn't have much interest in before. I was just listening to some Baroque. I went to a Baroque music concert when we were just in Chicago, and I really would never have done that before. It's like, it was not really something I'd experienced much, but I was able to take so much from that concert just because I was experiencing the music itself, and not worrying, not thinking of it like, from a more limited frame of mind.
It's like when you eat a piece of cake, you're not like, oh, I taste the egg they put in this, right? It's you're enjoying the cake, the whole thing. You're not just like focused on the little constituent elements that make up the cake.
Right. But as young as, I keep thinking about our audience here, which is probably a lot of horn players, right? Hopefully.
Absolutely.
When you're trained as a horn player, this, in my experience, was not how I was trained. I was trained to play Kopráš etudes perfectly.
Right.
And then transfer that to playing, Beethoven symphonies perfectly. Mm-hmm. And for me, the focus should have been like, let's think about music here. Mm-hmm. The great horn players are great musicians naturally, some of them, and great technicians also. The two have to come together. But I would just argue, as a composer, I'm just saying that the focus should never leave the idea that we have to make beautiful music.
Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah,
that we are musicians first and horn players second. That's essentially it.
Absolutely. Well, I could keep talking to you for like 3 more hours, because I have lots and lots of questions and things still, but I don't want to take up any more of your time today, Steven. But thank you so much for sharing that wealth of experience.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is, I think, kind of the reason we're talking, is that I just was so fortunate to have this piece played by the Chicago Symphony Horn Section, which is, without any exaggeration, just a dream come true for me, something that I never, ever expected. I've idolized the Chicago Symphony and the members of that brass section from, when I was a little boy, Dale Clevenger. And I'm just completely honored that that my friend Mark Allman, the new principal horn there, wanted to perform a piece of mine with his section.
And this was on the annual Christmas brass concert that the CSO brass does. Yeah.
Yes. And they did 2 pieces. The horn section did 2 pieces. Mine was one of them. And it was a very personal piece to me that I wrote about my experience with my mother, who died when I was very young. And but I was able to go back there, and I had 2 rehearsals with the section, which was just wonderful. And it's just an unbelievable horn section. I don't think there's a better horn section in the world. They all are fantastic players, and they support one another, and they were fully committed to playing my piece. And it was an honor to work with them. I mean, probably, I can't imagine another experience as a musician being more powerful for me than that.
Is there going to be a recording available, or is there one on YouTube or something?
There's nothing on YouTube. No, the concert was recorded. I'm not sure exactly what's happening with that. It was also interesting being in Chicago because one of my early teachers was Dave Craybill, who was the principal horn of the San Francisco Symphony, who was also a remarkable player. And he started his career playing in the Chicago Symphony. And he has also been somebody who's been supportive of my music. And, so there was a lot that came together in my mind at that concert and working with them that I'm just so grateful to have experienced. And coming out of that experience in Chicago, one of the trumpet players in the orchestra, Tage Larson, asked me to write a piece for him. So that's something that's going to be coming up later this year for me. I'm really, really looking forward to. So I don't know what to say, James. I'm a very fortunate person. I'm very grateful for these opportunities that have come my way. And that particular experience in Chicago remains just an amazing thing. That brass section is it's a work of art, and that horn section is just incredible. The beauty of sound that they create, the blend that they have, the tradition that they have.
Yeah.
At the end of that concert, Mick Mulcahy, who was conducting the concert, they did an encore, which is an arrangement by Tim Higgins of In the Bleak Midwinter, which is a gorgeous song by Gustav Holst. And Mick introduced that piece to the audience by saying that this stage where we're playing right now is a sacred place. And this concert is our gift to you.
Mm-hmm.
And we hope that you will take away from this concert a joy of music, the love of music, and take that feeling of joy home with you and spread it throughout the world. And it was just like, wow. I mean, this is what it is to be a musician.
We need more of that these days.
Yeah. We need more of that. And there's great power in what we do. The art of making music and spreading it in the world is an extremely powerful thing. And I'm grateful that I've been able to have a career in music, and I'm glad that there is a whole community of people out there that still work hard every day to pursue the art of making music.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderful way to spend your life.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yep. The Horn Call Podcast is the official podcast of the International Horn Society. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the International Horn Society. Copyright International Horn Society. Music by Brian K.M.